The night it all began, I was doing what I always did, playing games on my computer to distract myself from the unsettling feeling that crept into my room every evening. It was a feeling I couldn't quite explain, a sense of unease that filled the room as soon as the sun set. My window didn't face the street. It faced the balcony, where the darkness seemed to gather, deep and impenetrable, just a few feet away from me. I had just defeated another boss in my game when a noise caught my attention. A rattling sound from the balcony, like someone knocking over an empty can. I turned around, my eyes adjusting to the dim light coming from my desk lamp, and froze. My mother's face was peering through the glass, her eyes wide, her mouth forming a perfect O, as if she were singing a silent note. She was standing unnervingly close to the window, her forehead pressed against the glass. I laughed nervously, thinking she was trying to play a prank on me. But as I stared back at her, my smile faded. Something was off. Her eyes were too wide, her expression too still. The eerie silence filled the room, broken only by the soft clink of her forehead tapping the glass as if she were trying to get my attention in some bizarre, silent way. "Nom, enough," I called out, trying to sound more annoyed than afraid. From the doorway, I heard her reply, "What?" I whipped my head around, and there she was, standing in the hallway with a comb in her hand, her face a mix of confusion and concern. My heart stuttered. When I turned back to the window, the face was gone, leaving only the empty blackness of the balcony behind. "Mom," I whispered, my voice shaky. "You were just out there." Her expression grew serious as I told her what I'd seen. Together, we checked the balcony, the window, every corner of the apartment, but found nothing. It was like she had never been there at all. That night, I barely slept. And in the morning, unable to shake the fear, I asked my mom if she'd ever experienced anything similar. She paused, her eyes distant, as if recalling a memory she had buried long ago. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and hesitant, as if sharing a secret she had never told anyone. "When I was your age," she began, "something very similar happened to me." As my mother spoke, the room seemed to grow colder. She told me about a winter evening when she was 9 years old, living with my grandmother in a small, isolated house on the outskirts of town. Her mother, my grandmother, worked nights at a bread factory, often leaving the house late in the evening after dinner. On that particular night, my grandmother had already left, bundling up against the cold as she headed off to work. My mother had tidied up, finished her homework, and was about to go to bed when she felt thirsty. She walked into the dark kitchen and switched on the light, expecting the room to be empty. Instead, she found herself staring at my grandmother, who was sitting at the table, her cheek resting on her hand, smiling in a way that made my mother's skin crawl. It was a strange, unsettling smile, as if she had been waiting for my mother in the dark. Her lips stretched a little too wide, her eyes gleaming with an emotion my mother couldn't quite place. "Mom," she had asked, her voice barely a whisper, "did you forget something?" The woman at the table didn't reply. She simply continued to smile, her gaze fixed unblinkingly on my mother. Suddenly, her expression twisted into a look of rage, and she slammed her fist onto the table, her voice echoing through the kitchen. "I'll give you a closed coffin." At that moment, the light bulb burst, plunging the room into darkness. My mother remembered screaming, stumbling out of the kitchen and running to the neighbors. When the police arrived, they searched the house, but found no one. My grandmother returned home the next morning, completely unaware of what had happened. She never told my grandmother what she saw. My mother finished, her face pale. "I always thought it was some kind of hallucination. But now, after what you saw, I don't know." The words, "closed coffin," echoed in my mind, chilling me to the bone. Was this strange doppelganger a curse, passed down through our family? And if so, what did it want? The days that followed were filled with a tense, unspoken fear. My mother and I avoided the balcony at night, leaving the curtains drawn and the room dimly lit. I could sense her unease growing, though she tried to put on a brave face. She went about her daily routines, but her eyes would often linger on my bedroom door, as if she expected something to appear there at any moment. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a soft tapping sound. I froze, holding my breath, trying to determine its source. It was coming from the balcony again. The same faint tap, 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 like fingers drumming against the glass. Summoning all my courage, I pulled back the curtains, my heart pounding. There was nothing there, just the darkness of the balcony, the quiet city lights in the distance. But as I turned to leave, a shiver ran down my spine. I had the distinct feeling that I was not alone, that someone or something was watching me from the shadows. The next morning, I told my mother about the tapping, expecting her to brush it off as my imagination. Instead, her face grew serious, and she seemed to be debating whether or not to tell me something. I didn't want to scare you, she finally admitted, but I've been hearing it too. And I've seen it again. My blood ran cold. Seen what? Me, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Or something that looks like me, standing outside the house, looking in through the windows. It's like a shadow of myself, but twisted, like it's mocking me, a knot of fear twisted in my stomach. The figure wasn't just haunting me, it was haunting her too. We realized that whatever this entity was, it was getting bolder, revealing itself more often, almost as if it were waiting for something. But what? One evening, I returned home to find my mother waiting for me, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly. She took me by the arm and led me to the bathroom without a word. There, on the mirror, written in a dark, smeared substance that looked eerily like blood, were 3 words: I am coming. My mother's voice shook as she explained. I was brushing my hair, and I looked away for just a second. When I looked back, it was there. We scrubbed at the mirror, but no matter how hard we tried, a faint stain of the message remained, as if it had seeped into the glass itself. The message felt like a warning, a sinister promise that whatever was haunting us was preparing to make its move. The nights became unbearable. We could hear the tapping almost every evening now, coming from different parts of the house. Shadows flickered at the edges of our vision, and strange, distorted reflections appeared in every reflective surface. We both became paranoid, checking and double-checking that doors were locked, windows closed. Then, one night, I heard my mother scream. I rushed to her bedroom, my heart pounding. She was standing in front of her mirror, frozen in terror. In the mirror, a figure that looked exactly like her stared back, but it wasn't mimicking her movements. Instead, it wore a twisted smile, its eyes wide and dark. Slowly, it raised a finger to its lips, as if telling her to stay silent. Then it mouthed the words, "Closed coffin." We could no longer ignore it. Whatever this entity was, it wanted something from us. My mother and I decided to visit my grandmother, hoping that maybe she could shed light on what was happening. If anyone knew about the strange doppelgangers, it would be her. When we arrived at her house, my grandmother listened to our story in silence. Her face grew paler with each detail, and when we finished, she sighed, her hands trembling. "There's something I need to tell you," she said finally. "When I was young, our family was haunted by a spirit we called the second mother. She appeared to people as a reflection of someone they loved. A mother, a sister, sometimes even themselves. She would torment them, appearing in mirrors and windows, mimicking their movements but with dark, twisted expressions." "But why?" I asked, feeling my heart pounding. "What does she want?" "No one knows," my grandmother replied, her voice barely a whisper. "But the legend says that the second mother only disappears when she claims someone's life. She has an obsession with family, with blood. That's why she whispers about the closed coffin. It's her way of demanding a sacrifice." The realization settled over us like a heavy weight. The entity wanted one of us. It wouldn't stop until it claimed a life. That night, my mother and I made a pact. We would confront the entity together once and for all. We stayed up, every light in the house blazing, mirrors covered, waiting for the inevitable. Around midnight, the tapping began again. This time it was louder, more insistent. We stood together, clutching each other's hands. As the shadows in the room grew darker, deeper, the temperature plummeted, and then we saw her. The twisted reflection, staring back at us from the uncovered mirror. In one voice we spoke. "We know who you are. Leave our family alone." The figure's smile widened, her mouth stretching into an unnatural grin. Then, without a sound, she disappeared, leaving the room silent. Since that night, we haven't seen her again. But sometimes, when the house is quiet, I still hear the faint tap, tap, tap at the window. A reminder that the second mother is never truly gone, just waiting for her next opportunity. For weeks after the final confrontation, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. My mother and I were cautious, though. We avoided mirrors in dim light, kept the balcony curtains drawn at night, and tried to dismiss every unexplained noise as just the house settling. But deep down, we both knew that second mother wasn't gone for good. Then, one stormy evening, it happened again. As thunder rumbled in the distance and rain lashed against the windows, I heard it. A faint, persistent tap-tap-tap coming from the balcony. At first, I told myself it was just the wind rattling something outside. But as the tapping grew louder and more deliberate, my heart sank. It was unmistakable. This time, though, I felt a strange pull. Instead of running to my mother's room or hiding under the blankets, I found myself drawn to the sound. Almost in a trance, I walked to the balcony window and pulled back the curtains. And there she was, the figure that looked like my mother, standing right up against the glass, her face lit by an eerie, unnatural glow. She was smiling, but there was something wrong with her eyes. Wide and glassy, they seemed empty, devoid of life. Slowly, she raised her hand and tapped on the window again, her fingers long and skeletal. "Come outside," she mouthed silently, her lips moving but no sound coming out. I stumbled backward, breaking out of the trance. As I scrambled to my feet, I could hear her laugh, an unsettling, distorted sound that reverberated through the walls, chilling me to the bone. But there was something else. Amid the laughter, I thought I heard faint whispers. Voices overlapping, growing louder, as if others were joining her. It wasn't just the second mother out there. There were more of them. I ran to my mother's room, and together we waited, the laughter and whispers continuing through the night, echoing in our ears long after they faded. The next day, we went to my grandmother's house. I had an overwhelming sense that the only way to rid ourselves of the second mother was to uncover the truth about her origins. My grandmother had seemed reluctant to tell us much about the entity during our previous visit, and now I suspected she knew more than she'd admitted. This time, when we arrived, my grandmother was waiting for us, as if she knew we were coming. She looked frail, her hands shaking as she guided us to the kitchen. Once we were seated, she sighed and began to speak. "The second mother isn't just a ghost," she said. "She's something older, something dark that has haunted our family for generations. I've never told you this, but she's part of a curse." My mother and I exchanged glances, our faces pale. Centuries ago, my grandmother continued, one of our ancestors was accused of witchcraft. She was a healer, a midwife, but when children started disappearing in the village, people turned on her. They believed she was offering the children to dark forces in exchange for power. The villagers were so afraid that they executed her. My grandmother took a shaky breath, her voice thick with emotion. But as they hanged her, she swore she would return. Not as herself, but as a mother, a woman they could trust. She would come back to take something from each generation, to punish her own family for abandoning her to that fate. And since then, every few generations she appears to claim someone. She takes on the appearance of someone close, usually a mother or a beloved figure, and drives her victim mad with her haunting. "So she's here to claim one of us?" I whispered, a cold dread settling over me. My grandmother nodded, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Yes, and until she's satisfied, she won't leave." With the knowledge of the family curse weighing on us, my mother and I knew we had to do something drastic to protect ourselves. My grandmother told us of an old ritual, one she had only heard whispers about, passed down from generation to generation as a last resort defense against the second mother. "The ritual is dangerous," she warned, "but it might be the only way to break her hold on you." The ritual involved mirrors, objects the second mother seemed to favor. According to the instructions, we had to place mirrors around the house, creating a circle that would trap her reflection in a confined space, drawing her into it and, ideally, forcing her to reveal her true form. If we could confront her, my grandmother said, we might have a chance to banish her. That night, we set up mirrors in a circle around the living room. My mother lit candles and placed them by each mirror, casting an eerie glow over the room. As the candles flickered, shadows danced along the walls, and the atmosphere grew thick with tension. We took our positions inside the circle, my mother and I holding hands, chanting the words my grandmother had taught us. I see you, I know you, show yourself as you are. First, nothing happened. But then, the mirrors began to tremble. One by one, the reflections in each mirror began to shift, growing darker, distorted, as if something was pushing against the glass from the other side. And then, in every single mirror, she appeared. The second mother, her face twisted with rage, her mouth stretching open in a soundless scream. Her reflection looked different in each mirror, morphing into other family members, even into my own face, her expression filled with malice. Then, in the mirror directly in front of me, she spoke. You think you can banish me? She hissed, her voice low and guttural. I am in your blood. I am a part of you. There is no escape. Suddenly, the mirrors shattered, pieces of glass flying in all directions. The candles went out, plunging us into darkness, and the room filled with her laughter, deeper, louder, more menacing than ever before. The failed ritual left us shaken and defeated. It was clear now that the second mother was too powerful for any traditional banishment or ritual. She was bound to us by something stronger, something ancient that couldn't be broken so easily. My mother and I were exhausted, terrified, and on the brink of giving up. But then, my grandmother proposed a desperate plan, a final confrontation. If you want to end this, she said, her voice heavy, one of you will have to offer yourself to her. The idea was horrifying. The second mother demanded a life, a sacrifice to satisfy her rage. My mother immediately refused to let me even consider it, but I could see the resignation in her eyes. She was willing to give herself to save me. No, I shouted, grabbing her hands. We'll find another way. We have to. But deep down, I knew my grandmother was right. The curse couldn't be escaped, it had to be fulfilled. The only question was who would be taken. Late that night, while my mother slept, I made my decision. I walked back to the living room, clutching a photograph of my family, and spoke into the darkness. Take me, I whispered. If that's what you want, I'm here. The room grew colder, the shadows stretching toward me. I braced myself, expecting to feel her cold, skeletal fingers wrap around me. But instead, I heard a voice, soft, almost gentle, filled with sadness. You should not have called for me, child. In that instant, I felt a wave of sorrow, as if the entity was not just a vengeful spirit, but a tortured soul trapped in an endless cycle of pain and rage. The second mother appeared before me, her face no longer twisted with malice, but with a grief so profound it took my breath away. She looked like my mother, but older, worn, her eyes haunted by centuries of suffering. What do you want? I asked, my voice shaking. I want what was taken from me, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. I want my family, my peace. I realized then that this spirit, this curse, was born out of betrayal and isolation. She was not just a monster. She was a soul condemned to haunt her descendants, driven by a need for acknowledgement, for release. Taking a deep breath, I spoke the words that came from somewhere deep within me. I see you. I remember you. You are part of us. And we will not forget. The second mother stared at me, her expression softening. Slowly, she raised a hand, and instead of touching me, she placed it on her own heart. Her figure began to fade, her form becoming transparent, as if the acceptance she had craved for centuries was finally setting her free. As she disappeared, she whispered, "Thank you for seeing me." The house grew quiet, the air still and warm. The oppressive presence was gone, leaving only a peaceful silence. Since that night, the tapping, The voices, the eerie reflections, they all stopped. My mother and I felt a sense of relief, of calm, as if the curse had finally lifted. And yet, sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear her voice in my dreams. A soft, sorrowful whisper, reminding me that she is now at peace, but that she will always be watching over us, as part of our family's legacy.